Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for being on our show today. Would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me onto Dear Mind, You Matter. I am a psychologist. I'm also an author, and I am a wellness expert. I spent over 20 years at the VA in San Diego as a psychologist, and also I was an associate clinical professor at University of California, San Diego, and an adjunct professor at University of San Diego, which is a smaller liberal arts college. So lots of contact with clients, lots of contact with students, and lots of contact with the staff, just developing programs and taking care of business. I was also a yoga instructor for 15 years, believe it or not. And I use a lot of my skills as a yoga instructor to stay centered and balanced in the profession of psychology. I recently relocated from San Diego all the way to Savannah, Georgia. I'm out here in the South to slow down a little bit and also to focus on my writing now.
Amazing. Well, we're so excited to have you. We sort of swapped locations, you and I, but we have so much in common, and I love that you're here. And first of all, I want to tell everybody about, the amazing work that you've done, I think, and actually what we utilize in some of our facilities. You can't see this. I'm holding up your workbook.
Wow.
Thank you for sending it to me. My holiday was spent, nights and weekends being curled up, looking through it and just making copious amounts of notes. So now I really appreciate it. And before we sort of jump into a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of what we're going to focus on in this conversation today, which is really around, again, sort of mindfulness for addiction and sort of these really lovely, books and resources that you've put together, I always like to make sure we sort of step back really quickly and we look at, before we start a conversation, how do you define mindfulness, and what does that mean in your work, and just help us sort of shape what that looks like for our conversation today?
Yes, that is the $1 million question, right? What is mindfulness? I think of mindfulness probably like John Kabat-Zinn, who was a doctor in Massachusetts and has been a leader in mindfulness and meditation. I think of it as being in the present moment and releasing judgment. Being mindful means to center yourself in the present moment, which a lot of us can do if we really focus on it and we learn the skill. The tricky part, of course, is releasing judgment of yourself, judgment of other people. So I think in recovery, releasing judgment is one of the skills we would need to tackle to be able to bring in mindfulness, because there's so much critical thinking of folks who are addicted and in early recovery. There's a lot of inner bully going on. So we like to bring in ways to calm the mind down so that you can focus and make good decisions about your recovery journey.
That's a beautiful definition, and it leads us easily into the next question that I have is really, what can we do specifically for addiction recovery to incorporate mindfulness? Like, what are some tips or advice or words of wisdom?
Well, you guys know that addiction includes cravings and triggers, right? Let's start with cravings first. We all have cravings. I mean, this is normal, natural stuff, right? The brain wants something and it craves it. We're all kind of in the same boat in that. People who are addicted have this constant, everyday, sometimes every hour craving for drugs or alcohol, or it could be shopping, it could be gambling, of course, all the behavioral addictions. So mindfulness is a way to slow down the ability to react to cravings. So if you have a craving for drugs or alcohol, for example, even during the pandemic, it's been a little bit out of control, of course. We'll talk about that, I hope. Mindfulness just tells you to be in the present moment, slow down, breathe. I even have on my desk a little, I don't know if you can see this, a little stone that says breathe, because I too need to breathe as we go through life. So it's just a reminder. And mindfulness is a reminder to slow down, be in the moment, look at your environment, have your feet on the ground, focus on the inhaling and the exhaling before you make a decision whether you're going to return to alcohol or drugs. That's what's so cool about it. So that's the cravings part. And the trigger part is that Most people get triggered in environments that are high risk. For example, walking by a bar or being with family members that really agitate you or what have you. And mindfulness, once again, the ability to breathe, slow down, be in the present moment, look around you and not react is one way to manage some of the triggers that are going to be happening.
Well, that's super helpful. And I think, there are so many triggers. There are so many things that, and I would love to talk more about the pandemic too. And I think everybody can benefit from more mindfulness in their lives, right? Because I think if ever there was a time where it's felt chaotic and out of control and like everything's going wrong, it's now, right? It has been for the last couple of years. It's like, what the heck? We're still here. So, somebody isn't necessarily needing to go into treatment or ready to buy a workbook or invest in any other like counseling services to address this. Like, what are some of the things or what are tools that they can use that would be helpful for them?
Right. Attached to mindfulness is meditation. And I do really want to give a shout out to learning skills to meditate. And for me, what I do every morning is I spend about 15 minutes on my meditation cushion and I look out to my backyard. So I have a beautiful vista of nature, which is another important component to wellness. What I do is I close my eyes and I count to 10 with my eyes closed. That's it. We don't have to complicate things, folks. It's really simple. So being able to meditate for someone in recovery is a game changer. I mean, you really do begin the process of slowing down your mind. So counting to yourself from 1 to 10 with every in breath and out breath is a 1, in breath, out breath is a 2. Most people can't get to 10. That's normal. I get to about 3 and then my mind starts spinning around. That's normal too. The mind wants to think. So that's a skill that's used in recovery centers, that's used all over the place, obviously in yoga, to really begin the process of regaining a sense of mastery of how you're thinking and to decrease some of that. Another thing I like to do is have little mantras, which could be mindful mantras, like a thought, like if you have a negative thought coming in, like I'm stressed out about going to the grocery store or something like that, you can actually use the opportunity to have the thought float like a leaf down the stream. So the ability to kind of take the thought, not attach to it, let it move down the stream, just like it's in the water going down the stream, and release it. So this is an ongoing practice of continually taking the negative thoughts that are agitating you, affecting you negatively, and moving them through. Thoughts aren't permanent. Feelings aren't permanent. So once you learn that as someone in recovery, that, hey, this feeling of anger is not permanent, you have a little more sense of mastery of what's happening for yourself.
I love the example that you use. I used to use the cloud in the sky floating by. I much prefer now the leaf floating down the stream.
Yes.
Even as you were talking through, I think that really lovely example too of just, incorporating some breath work in with the meditation and counting with it just up to 10. I mean, it is so interesting to me that when I end up seeing people sometimes that it's become such a challenge for them to kind of let go of overcomplicating what meditation should be. A quote, air quotes around the should, right?
So exactly.
It's just that constant struggle. And really when you're able to give someone the tools and sort of that power to take it back and say, it's really what you make it. And it can be this simple or complicated. It's just sort of working through that, seeing what works for you. So I really appreciate those examples. And it's a great place to start. Although I know it's very challenging for a lot of people who, when that is where they start, it's where they also tend to get stuck sometimes. So one of the things, gosh, I just keep going back to your books because they're so great. But one of the things I love, and this isn't necessarily something that's wildly different, with similar workbooks that might be out there, but I really appreciate how you specifically lay things out here. And one of the things I wanted to talk more about also is, the idea of understanding loss and why that's so important. But I think before we get into that, I think it's really interesting. You've already brought up, cravings and triggers and emotions, like all of these things are thoughts. All of these things are chapters within your workbook, right? So you're really taking people on a methodical journey, step by step, chapter by chapter, on how to address these things. So I think one thing that's really important for people to understand, maybe, if they're looking at really wanting to self-guide through something like this, is how do you sort of come to that conclusion of, this should really be the way that we're guiding someone on this journey versus taking another approach? How did you come to that with sort of what you're putting forth here in the Mindfulness Workbook for Addiction?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to make it user-friendly, reader-friendly. That's the most important thing for us. My co-author, Julie, and I spent a lot of time making sure it was available, could be used by, and it is being used in prisons, folks who are struggling, who are incarcerated versus teens, treatment centers, so we really wanted to widen the scope of what, who could use the book. And we also wanted to make it, this book, unlike other books, really integrates cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm sure you guys talk about, and dialectical behavioral therapy. These are different therapy approaches, as well as, of course, mindfulness and Buddhist concepts. So these are different approaches, but the concepts are so friendly that you can actually weave in any of the 60 plus exercises that we have. We're big fans of lots of exercises in the book. You can go in and out. Like you said, if you want to focus on feelings, you can go to the feelings chapter and choose one of a dozen or 10 or so handouts, worksheets, and actually weave it into your therapy approach. So it's sort of the widest scopeness that I think we can possibly do, because we were seeing such diverse clients. Julie and I, we really wanted to make sure everyone was accounted for, in the workbook. So, it's heart to heart, go to the client and see what they actually need. We were boots on the ground working when we did this workbook. We weren't in an ivory tower just doing research, which I do love, but we were actually day to day seeing people, That helps make a good workbook.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate that. And thanks for further explaining that. So to circle back to loss and sort of that overall huge concept, why is this understanding and sort of being able to work through process, why is this so important specifically in recovery?
Yeah, I love this question. It's my favorite question because when Julie and I were working on this book, like literally meeting every week, talking about what's the most important thing to grab hold of, loss kept coming up for both of us. In other words, we scanned the research at the time and we said, what is out there on loss and grief? And there wasn't much out there on addiction and loss. We actually were almost going to call the book Loss and Addiction. That was my original title, because in my family, there was a lot of loss and also addiction. So I was coming from that background, and maybe Julie was also. So we were trying to figure out how to heal. And of course, all of our clients at the time were struggling with loss, either coming from trauma, like you mentioned, trauma and loss, early traumatic events, and then going toward addiction. And then they would have more loss, So it was a huge cycle of loss, addiction, addictive behavior, and more loss. And so we were kind of struggling to make sure we understood this. And so what we did was we kind of developed a loss, addiction, loss cycle of understanding, and to try to figure out how to best serve the clients. A lot of our clients had lost family member, had lost families, they've lost jobs, they've also, believe it or not, lost freedom. We worked with folks who were incarcerated, coming out of being in the justice system, where they had lost freedom for a long period of time. In fact, addiction in the justice system is between 50 and 80% of folks who are incarcerated have a substance abuse problem. So any clinician out there, you're going to be dealing with folks who've been in the justice system if you're dealing with addiction, right? So in other words, we desperately needed to address this issue.
Well, thank you for explaining that. It's definitely needed and very well, very, very prevalent. But as you brought up being stuck, I think for a lot of us, there are a lot of strong emotions that can leave us feeling stuck, right? So what should we do when that kind of comes into play in our lives where we just feel very stuck in what's going on?
Right. And these stuck feelings are fairly strong, right? There's exhaustion, there's anger, what I think of right now, isolation, very intense, strong emotions. And traditionally, if you were using drugs or alcohol, you would obviously move to that to numb yourself out. And understandable, the emotions are strong. However, Julie and I, we're working really hard to understand how do you get unstuck. And one of the ways that we like, along with taking the emotion, like let's just say anger, for example, inviting it in and trying to figure out what is actually going on underneath the emotion. So in other words, we want anger to be a beloved teacher that you learn from, or a respected coach that you learn from. We want you to bring it into the therapy room, or if you're at home working on your workbook, bring it in and see if we can figure out what's going on underneath it. Usually there's softer emotions underneath that are being kind of protected, like feeling sad, hurt, some of these softer emotions. So along with bringing it into the room, we also want you to bring patience into the room. So my feeling is that stuck emotions really need your attention, and they also need to have that kind of that yin yang of self-compassion and patience. I'm a big fan of self-compassion, being your best friend, seeing what your best friend would say to you in a situation where you're feeling really angry and enraged, and bringing that into the room so you can kind of begin the process of healing.
I love that. I really appreciate that in your, I don't know if it's in your workbook as well, but I know in the Gift of Recovery, see me plugging more of your work.
Thank you.
That you have a whole section that's you talk about emotions, but then you go into these really strong emotions. And I think another thing that's really helpful, and Allison and I have talked about this a lot in the past, and we both use affirmations a lot. But what I know you love them, because the other thing that I noticed about the book is you have so many, and they're not the cookie cutter that you see out there that no one can relate to.
Right.
And so I love that you've really added, each topic. I mean, you've got such a plethora to pull from. And just like you're saying, when you're someone that's in this position and you're constantly beating yourself up and you're constantly struggling with these really strong, intense emotions, for example, in one of these here, for especially strong feelings, an affirmation can just be, today I allow my feelings to exist without judgment. And that just being what someone's going to work towards. It doesn't need to be, I'm this amazing person and I'm going to say something that I don't actually believe about myself, but it's really putting forth, something that you're really going to try to just allow yourself to do, which I think is so great. So I could talk about these all day, but again, we've talked a little bit about the pandemic and, potentially how that's impacted. So what have you seen there? And have you seen any shifts in what you feel like has been more or less helpful for people during this time? Give us a glimpse into the, kind of work you're doing there and what you're seeing as the most helpful or beneficial during this really difficult period.
Yeah, well, obviously, we're all in the same boat here. I mean, there's no one who gets away scot-free on these last 2 years. What I want to convey about the pandemic and lapses, which do happen during this time, a lapse is not a relapse. So if someone lapses to a substance, I would recommend that they remind themselves that a lapse is a one-time, falling off the wagon kind of thing, where you use a drug or alcohol and then you realize, oh my God, let me get back on the horse. Let me get back on track, whether you need to talk to your mental health provider, or you want to go to a virtual AA meeting, or whatever it is, or talk to friends and family, whatever it is you do for your wellness basket. If you have a lapse, just jump back into the basket. And so I want to convey that. So a relapse is when you just use the drug or alcohol for a long period of time. In other words, you go back to old behaviors. And we want to say, ooh, before we hit that, we want to say, ooh, that's old behavior. That's old material that's coming up because I'm stressed due to the pandemic. I'm isolated. I haven't seen my family, whatever the situation is. And there's a lot of situations. I would just want to convey to folks, your listeners, that call it a lapse. Move into the lapse if you have a lapse, and go back to your wellness basket and return to the things that make you feel the strongest.
Well, that is beautiful advice. And I hope that anybody that's listening right now that maybe has experienced that lapse, to go back to the wellness basket, move forward. Don't beat yourself up.
Right.
Don't shame yourself. Like, that's not going to do anything. Tomorrow is a new day. So
yes,
thank you for bringing light to that. I think it's a really important message for sure. And Rebecca, we love to ask everybody that comes on this show one question. And at this point in your life, what matters to you most right now?
Oh, thank you for that question. It makes me reflect on a lot of what I've been seeing, and also myself personally. And what matters to me most right now is 100% mental health. I mean, I know you guys are doing this in this podcast and you're talking about it every day or every week, but it is so important what you're doing. And it is so important for me to recommit to my mental health. Even after 25 years of being a psychologist, I still need to go back and recommit every single day.
I love it. We were talking about that earlier today, and just how interesting it is when we sort of are the folks that are pushing forward, trying to be, a lot of us now, even beyond, experts or people who are clinicians and work in this space, right? Just so many people are putting their story and their face out there. But at the end of the day, we also have to lead by example.
Right.
Otherwise, what good are we going to be to helping other people? So it's such an important message. And I'm glad that that's, on your radar as to what matters most to you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So thank you again for joining us today. I wish we had the rest of the day to talk, but can you share with our listeners how they can find you?
Sure. I always keep it simple. My website is mindfulnessworkbook.com. And if to contact me, you can click on that and get in touch with me that way. It also has a lot of information about books. I want to put your podcast on there too. So once it's finished, we'll have that up there, up and running for other folks who come to the website to find you and us. And also another great thing I wanted to mention to you guys, you can get CEUs, continuing education credits, for reading our workbook. And that's also on the website. So if you're a therapist listening and you need CEU credits for your licensure or certification, I'm on 13 CEU sites, and this way, you already have the book. So just go ahead and take the test and get your credit. And that's a fun thing to do if you're a therapist.
Sign me up.
I love it. And we'll go ahead. We should include that too. We have this awesome program. Well, we've got all of our continuing education events that we host through Advanced Recovery Systems as well. But we're getting ready to launch ARS University. Shh, don't tell anybody. But so we will include all of this in there too. This is great, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being on our show today, for all of the work that you have done and all of the tools that you have provided so many people with to help on their journey. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.